Medic 43, District 1, Engine 51, response, cardiac arrest.
Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another edition of the MCHD Paramedic Podcast. This is Dr. Casey Patrick. And on today's episode, we have a special guest, Peter Canning. And Peter is joining us today to talk about an issue that we have all seen in emergency care, whether you're a paramedic, an AMT, an EMT out in the field, whether you're an emergency physician or emergency nurse in the hospital. Over the past decade plus, we have all come into contact with the opioid epidemic, and it's a part of our daily lives. And Peter has written a couple books, and this episode title today is A Medic's Guide to the Opioid Epidemic. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, Peter, please tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got here today on the MCHD Paramedic Podcast talking about the opioid crisis in America and really what your unique perspective has been throughout this whole ordeal.
Great. Thanks, Casey. First of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be on. I'm in Connecticut. I've been a paramedic for over 30 years, working mainly in Hartford, Connecticut. For the last 15 years, I've also been the EMS coordinator at UConn John Dempsey Hospital. When I started as a paramedic back in 1995, I responded to some overdoses, and at the time, if I resuscitated someone, I would say to them, what's wrong with you? You're going to end up dead or you're going to end up in jail. I thought that people who use drugs had a character flaw. Over time, as the overdoses started to increase, particularly, around 2005 or so, and then continuing up till 2015 when fentanyl arrived, the more overdoses I saw, I wanted to know what was going on. So I started, talking to people. I started reading journals, talking to law enforcement, talking to substance use experts. But it really wasn't until I started talking to my patients and hearing their stories that I started to understand the epidemic a lot more. And I came to understand that substance use is not a character flaw, but that it's actually, a chronic relapsing brain disease. And that most of the people who are out there suffering were normal people once. I've had so many of them would say to me, I used to be a normal person once. And then something happened. They fell off a ladder. They got in a car accident. They got hurt playing sports. They went to their doctor. They got a prescription for opioids. And, as things carried on, they ended up, many of them out on the street, having, lost their families and their homes and their friends. So it really it became a really interesting thing to me. I wrote a book about it called Killing Season, Paramedics Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Opioid Epidemic. And then following that, my publisher asked me to write a guide for family and friends, because what was happening in a lot of overdose scenes is I would end up telling the family, you have to have naloxone. Here's where you can get it. Here's how you use it. Don't blame your child for what's happened to them. Show them love. Here's some places that they can go to get treatment. So I've written 2 books about it now, and I've also been very involved on the state level with a lot of committees. I'm on the state overdose fatality review panel. I've written some journal articles looking at the data behind the opioid epidemic. So it's just really become very fascinating to me.
I believe you have a super unique perspective when you pair together your work with the state, your work with the evidence, then add in the fact that you spent decades on the truck. And one of the things in your intro there that was very, very impactful to me, just hearing what you described as all of this input that was coming in, and you stopped and said, wait a minute, I'm going to talk to my patients, which is so powerful. And we stress that at all levels when we're talking about things like, a good history and physical for an acute myocardial infarction, or a good history and physical for a trauma patient, or a patient who we are worried that is, having a stroke and we're looking for the last known well. And there's also something to be gained from these patients as well. And I think that is an excellent reminder for all of us, making that transition to patient blaming into today's world of harm reduction and consideration of opiate use disorder and substance use disorder as a disease and not a character flaw, like you said in your lectures. And you were gracious enough to share these with me, and looking through them. One of the parts that this leads us directly into that I wanted to get your take on is you described some specific patients who impacted your perspective. And so many times when experts and folks who've written books and folks who've written journal articles come and talk to the folks who are actually out there with the boots on, in the field, on the ground, they don't have that day-to-day experience that you have to go with it. And so to me, that was one of the more impactful pieces looking through your educational material. So I really wanted you to talk just briefly about some of those individual patients and how they impacted your transition through time in seeing these folks as patients with a true addiction disorder, as opposed to that older thought of patient blaming. Tell the listeners about a couple of those patients.
Sure. I got called one day for a car into a pole out in front of a gas station. As I pulled up, I approached the car, found a young woman was slumped over the wheel. Opened the door up. I could see a syringe and some drug paraphernalia on the floor, and she was agonal breathing. Gave her some naloxone and brought her around, and she looked very familiar to me. And she's very upset. Oh, my father's going to kill me. I just got out of rehab. I destroyed the car, and so I was taking care of her, and then I started asking her some questions like, "What other medical history did you have?" She goes, "I broke my back cheerleading." And then that's what I recognized her from, because a couple of years before, on a Friday night, I had been at a football game, and she was one of the cheerleaders. And at halftime of the big game, they'd thrown her and another girl up in the air, and they were both doing somersaults, and they caught the first girl, and then they dropped her. Everyone went silent. Her father came down out of the stands, and we ended up, at the time, we board and collared her. And we're taking her to the hospital, and she was crying, "Daddy, Daddy, my back hurts." And took her to the hospital. Turned out she had broken her back. And what she said is that they gave her a prescription for opioids. She got on it. They made her feel better than she had felt before. They made her feel whole in a way that she hadn't. When her prescription ran out, they gave her another prescription for a stronger amount, and then eventually they knocked her off the prescription altogether. She was very sick. She told me, she started buying opioids on the pills on the street, but the pills were very expensive. The guy who sold her the pills before long was selling her heroin, which was much cheaper and stronger. And then she graduated from snorting to injecting. And I just thought, it's like, what would the trajectory of her life have been like if they had caught her that day? She would have gone to the dance. Maybe she married the quarterback and be living in a house with a white picket fence. But instead, here she is now, out of rehab a couple times, with her dreams going into a hole in her arm. Fortunately, when we got to the hospital, she was very upset, very worried about her father. And her father came in, and her father gave her a big hug and said, "Don't worry, we're going to beat this. We're going to beat this together." So that was a nice thing to see. Another patient that really impacted me, there's a hospital in our town that had been closed down and was now just a rehab center. But if you drive by on the street and you're not familiar, you might think it's a hospital. So a car pulls up in front of it, open up the door, they push a guy out and take off. The fire department gets there and it revives him with naloxone. I get there shortly after. We get him in the ambulance, and he says to me, it's like, what a scumbag I am to have almost died like this. I was supposed to take my daughter trick-or-treating tonight. And then while we're examining him, we notice he's got a little hole in his chest, a little scar. And what's that from? Well, he got shot in Iraq. his Humvee hit one of those explosive devices, and he was in an ambush. And he's telling me a story. The day after 9/11, he volunteered to join the Army. He goes to the Army. He gets shot. He gets, gets addicted to the pills. He gets out. He ends up, separating from his wife. He's, sleeping on people's couches. He gets arrested for a failure to appear, and he just now had gotten out of jail. His buddies picked him up and gave him a little bit of a bag of fentanyl for him to as a get out of jail present. His tolerance was down, so he took it, and it was too much for him. He turned blue, and then they tossed him out of the car. Like in the military, they have everything, leave no one behind. And here's this guy thinking, what a scumbag I am. He joined the Army the day after 9/11. What would the trajectory of his life have been if he hadn't done that? If he had continued about, his regular day. And the last one that I'll tell you was we noticed a young girl on the street who was sort of new in town. She looked very sick. We sort of pulled over, talked to her. I gave her a little bit of money and an apple. I saw her later in the day, and she thanked us, said she was feeling better. And I saw her a couple days later, and I was asking her, as I always ask them now, when did you first start doing opioids? And she said, when I was a little girl, my mother gave me up for heroin, and I was raised by my grandmother. I always wanted to know what it was about heroin that made my mother love heroin more than me. And she goes, so when I tried heroin the first time, I understood my mother. That's how powerful these opioids can be. So these three and countless others who told me their stories completely changed my mind about how I used to address, how I used to feel about people. Everyone out there has an incredible story, and none of them just woke up and decided that they wanted to become opioid addicts. Many of them got, sent down a pathway that they could never have envisioned, and that is terribly hard to extricate themselves from.
It's amazing, powerful stories, and I believe those are as important as any statistics or confidence intervals or p-values we could throw out. When we think about the old way, and I'll throw myself in this and totally go with we, because I have been guilty of all of these stigmatizing behaviors and stigmatizing language. And for those that aren't as up to date in talking to and dealing with opiate use disorder patients, why is an evolution in our thinking necessary? In other words, what's wrong with the old way, and how can stigma actually be harmful to patients? Talk to the listeners a little bit about that sort of line of thinking, because a lot of folks are just, they're stuck in their ways, and that's very common in all walks of life, in paramedicine and emergency care as well.
Yeah, absolutely. When I started, I remember, my first orientation, a guy came in a, white iron shirt with the badges on it, and he was talking to me about, you're going to go out there in the city streets, and you're going to have to deal with the junkies and the drunks, and he went on and on. And so that's sort of how I felt at first, and that's how I tended to treat people. And the culture was sort of, it's like, you've overdosed, and I'm wasting my time taking care of you when I could be taking care of somebody who's short of breath or having a heart attack. But in time, I came to understand that the problem with stigma is that it tends to drive people away from seeking care. So many times you go to the ER, and you'll hear the ER nurse, like, yelling at somebody, and the patient yells back at the ER nurse, and these are drug seekers. And why are they seeking drugs? Because they're in pain or because they're sick. And how did they get there? As I mentioned, everybody has these stories. But the point is, with like stigma, is if you call someone by a bad name or you treat them badly, they're not going to want to get help. They're going to hide their use. 91% of the people who die from opioid overdoses die using alone, because they've been driven into the shadows, because the society has said that, you're an abuser, you're dirty. Just the use of these words can be very, very powerful. And one of the things that I learned about opioids is that they work not just on physical pain, but on emotional pain. Um, you all remember the Columbine shooting. There was a guy named Austin Eubanks who was a student at the school, and he and his best friend, hid under the tables in the cafeteria when the shooters came in. His best friend was killed. He was, injured by the gunfire. He had never used drugs before, and he got an opioid prescription. And he said that the opioids helped not so much for his physical pain, but for his guilt and for his emotional pain. He ended up going through quite an odyssey of using drugs. He got over it. He became a speaker and tried to help people. He came to Connecticut and gave a speech before a convention here about everything that he had learned, and he got a standing ovation. 2 weeks later, he was found dead of a fatal overdose. Again, what would the trajectory of his life have been like if he hadn't been if the shooters hadn't come to Columbine that day? If you treat people badly, they're not going to get care. And opioid substance use disorder is something that can be treated. It can be treated with methadone and buprenorphine, and with love and empathy. So we really don't want to drive people away from care. I've tried to send a lot of patients that I've known, tried to get them to get into treatment, and a lot of them just don't want to take the step of going through the ER because when they've been there before, they've been treated so badly.
If we yelled at asthmatics to go to the pulmonologist, or diabetics to go to the endocrinologist, or folks with high blood pressure and hypercholesterolemia to go to the cardiologist, they would probably be less likely to follow up.
Absolutely.
And so it really is, it's just like any other medical issue. If we meet that with disdain and poor tone and, God forbid, yelling, we can't expect our patients to trust us, to confide in us, and surely not to seek care or take our advice. So you mentioned buprenorphine and methadone, a term that folks that aren't in this world may have heard or be familiar with or wonder what it means. That definitely was a new term for me a few years back. Is the idea of harm reduction. And it's a little bit newer for some. Some of the less experienced folks out there may not know this term. So describe just in general what harm reduction is, how you've implemented it into your practice, and maybe a couple of examples of what harm reduction means.
Well, so harm reduction in the general world is something as simple as wearing a seatbelt when you're driving, putting on a helmet when you're on a motorcycle, putting on sunscreen when you go out under the sun. Harm reduction as it applies to drug usage is basically it recognizes that people are going to use drugs. And what it seeks to do is to keep them safe until they're ready to move on to the next stage of their journey. So some of the things that for harm reduction would be naloxone, giving naloxone to the public. Now, when I first started, we went to overdose scenes. Basically, you might find somebody, they would have thrown him in the shower or put ice in his pants. And now, half the time I get there, the patient's already been revived with naloxone. Naloxone's been very key in saving a lot of lives so that these people can see another day, because one of the slogans is that dead people don't recover. Dead people don't make good decisions. Other things with harm reduction is needle exchange. Instead of sharing needles among people and spreading diseases like AIDS or hepatitis, endocarditis is also can come from dirty needles. It's making certain that people are able to get clean needles, and in the act of getting the clean needle, it's not just getting that needle, but it's the human interaction. It's that this person cares about you. And now the other thing with these things is that they save so much money. The small cost of a needle can save huge amounts in later costs, hospitalization for AIDS or hepatitis. Um, there's lots of different things with the harm reduction, but it's basically just trying to help people along their journey until they get to a point, to a better place.
So we've hit on real life stories. We've talked about progression over time. We've debunked some stigma, introduced the concept of harm reduction. Now, you've been on the truck, you've been in the world of EMS for literally decades, and you know these folks. They're in your service. You've come into contact with them in various ways, and uh, partners and station mates, and folks in training exercises throughout your career. You can picture them. I know them. I know that I have folks in the hospital who fall into the same bucket. They've heard all of these stories and all of this new information, and they say, "Yeah, I hear you, but I'm not buying in all the way. I'm still reluctant. Uh, I'm a creature of habit. I practice the way that I learned." What do you say to those really hard nuts to crack? Those people that are really set in their ways, that say, you know what, these folks are making bad decisions and they are wasting my time, and this is a character flaw. I hear you, but I just don't know. I don't buy it. How do you break down walls with your colleagues, your coworkers, who you can read in their face, in their facial expressions, in their tone? You give them some of this information and they just don't buy it. They don't digest it. How do you break down those walls?
So it can be difficult. Was working with a partner this last week, and we had a great day today, great day working together. And then at the end of the day, we just happened to get into a discussion, and she was like, they're giving naloxone out like candy, and I'm a diabetic, and insulin is expensive, and don't couldn't these people be making smarter decisions with their lives? And it's a tough thing to argue with at times. But what I try to do is try to explain to them the science of addiction, how it's not always just a choice, um, how the brain can get hijacked, by the opioids. So one of the best explanations that I've had was given to me was, someone said, is that humans they've evolutionary evolved for three things: to eat, to have sex, and to take care of their children. And so when you eat, if you like pizza, you get a firework goes off in your brain. Sometimes just the thought of eating pizza will send off a fireworks of endorphins in your brain. But when you take opioids, it's not just one firework that goes off in your brain. It's like the 4th of July spectacular in your brain. And eventually that the power of that is so strong, you get it, and then you anticipate getting it more, and you start to crave it, and again it creates this tract in your brain so that it tricks you into believing that heroin is the key to your survival. That's why some people shoot up in front of their kids, or they rob in front of police officers. um, I tell people, you can take somebody with substance use disorder, and you can put them in an MRI, and you can see the damage to their brain. And so to expect somebody with long term substance use disorder to always act rationally in their best interest is akin to expecting someone with COPD to climb Mount Everest, or someone with a broken leg to run a 100-yard dash. So I try to talk about the science, and then what you brought up earlier is compare to some other diseases. We don't castigate the person with COPD for their smoking. Somebody with diabetes, we don't yell at them if they broke their diet. We try to treat everybody with compassion, and people with substance use disorder deserve the same. Um, and then again, I just fall back on is, like, talk to these people. Sit down with somebody who you meet on the street, and instead of judging them, try to see things through their eyes, hear their stories, because their stories are very powerful and very tragic in many cases of how they got to where they are.
Yeah, I find that it's difficult in those situations with your partner speaking directly to her argument as to why insulin is extremely expensive and naloxone is often free with grant funding, and that distracts from the fact that we should treat everybody with compassion and with empathy, and that's part of our task as physicians, clinicians, paramedics, EMTs, AMTs. But logically, it makes no sense, and I am surely not smart enough or not qualified enough to come down with the cure for pharmaceutical costs in this country and some of the disparities and the dysfunctionality that exists there, no matter what side of the political spectrum that you come down
Right.
on.
One of the
That's
points I tried to
difficult.
make with her is that most people with, if they're on Medicare, even Medicaid, is that they get the medication that they need. They get breathing treatments and drugs for COPD. They get the heart attack drugs. They get the diabetic drugs. But the fact is that so many people with substance use disorder are unable to get the drugs that can help them. The medication assisted treatments that we talked about, the buprenorphine and methadone, it's very hard for a lot of them to get on those drugs, which have been proven to help.
Absolutely. And when you look at mortality reduction with some of those drugs, that was really my turning point. Not to turn it into my story, but I was a patient blamer and a stigmatizer and a product of medical training in the late 90s and early 2000s as well. And really the look at the mortality reduction with single exposure to buprenorphine following an overdose and comparing that to those who don't get that treatment, um, just a drastic mortality reduction. And that was an eye opener for me probably 7 or 8 years ago. So, another lesson in this discussion today, I hope everybody takes, is that old dogs absolutely can learn new tricks. And just because the way you were trained was impactful on you at that time, it evolves and medical science evolves and our knowledge evolves. And it's incumbent upon all of us to be curious, to be empathetic, and to learn when approaches, medication, terminology, when these things change, we have to stay up to date. So that takes us in a pretty good spot to wrap up, Peter. Just before we close out totally, where are some places our listeners can go get information about you, about your projects? You mentioned your books. Where can folks find you out there in the world? Because I got a copy of the Family and Friends Guide to the Opioid Overdose Epidemic, and it really is excellent. It's a nice, compact, short read, and I would recommend it to anyone out there. But where can folks find you?
So my books can be purchased online. Amazon has all of them. I wrote 2 books about my early years as a paramedic that are available. I have the 2 books about the opioid epidemic, and I have 3 fictional works. I also have a blog. It's called Street Watch Notes of a Paramedic, which I've had for about 20 years now. It's at www.medicscribe.com. And I write about all sorts of EMS issues there, not just about the opioid epidemic.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate you joining us today on the podcast. I believe this information is vital for all of us in emergency medicine, and I lump uh, EMS, paramedics, EMTs, AMTs into that group. This is a unfortunate medical issue that we are going to continue to come into contact with, but we have a better way today than we had 10, 20 years ago, and we need to be the leaders and at the forefront of the approach that involves harm reduction and destigmatizing and medication assisted therapy for opiate use overdose and substance use disorders, when we can start to make those connections and be empathetic and drive folks to seek care as opposed to avoid care and end up in that lonely spot that you talked about. um, what better difference, what better impact can we make? I will link Peter's blog address and spots to find Peter's books in the show notes. Again, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
As always, if
thanks
you have
again. Thank you.
questions, ideas, for future episodes, please email podcast@mchd-tx.org. Leave us a like, leave us a review wherever you listen. Peter, I'll leave you the last word. Fire away.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on, Casey. If I could have a final word, it would be from the Hippocratic Oath. We all know the lines, "First do no harm," but there's another line in there that is particularly powerful. It says, "Into whatsoever house I enter, I will enter to help the sick." And I think that's the good way to view it, is that, these are people out here, and we want to take care of them as we take care of all our patients with love and with empathy.
I can't come up with a better closing note than that. As always, thank you all for listening. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. We'll be back with another episode soon.
Thanks, Casey.
This podcast was brought to you by the Montgomery County Hospital District, Texas. Production and editing by Andrew Adams. Questions or comments, which are always welcome, can be sent to podcast@mchd-tx.org. Make sure to subscribe above to keep updated to all our future casts. Music, copyright, Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0.